Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com program, brought to you by Techstrong, AWS, and Aqua Security. My name is Cody J. Brown, the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting panel ahead. Ronnie, glad we got you on. Good to hear. So I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes before I let Ronnie and Merritt take over. So first off, today's session is being recorded. So if you would like to rewatch or share with a friend today's program, you will receive an email with a link to access that program shortly after we conclude our recording today. If you have any questions, we want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. Now, that's also where you'll find the chat tab, and that's where we want you to get to know your fellow audience members. Let us know where you're from or maybe what your role is in your organization. We do have a couple of handouts available under that handouts tab, so feel free to check those out at your own leisure. Our sponsor has provided those for you today. And of course, before we close out, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. So our forecast today reads cloudy with a chance of DevSecOps. And joining me is Merritt Baier, principal in the AWS Office of the CISO, and Rani Osnat, SVP of Strategy at Aqua Security. So Rani and Merritt, thank you both so much for joining me. Merritt, you want to take it from here?
Sure. Yes. Thank you so much, Cody. It is fun to be here. And we are going to kind of switch up formats here by doing a dual fireside chat where we interview each other. But your chat is live. If folks are tuned in, why don't you post where you're coming in from? And we'll get a sense of where in the world we all are. I am in Denver today. It is quite pretty out, although we are definitely feeling it turn to fall here. And we are going to talk to you about cloud and the ways that DevSecOps or SecDevOps or just DevOps, as some of us like to call it, are constructing ways to mechanize and get better at this over time. As Cody mentioned, I am a principal in the office of the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer at AWS, Amazon Web Services, or the cloud. So I'm available for folks to follow up with. I'm on Twitter at Merritt Baier. And I'm joined today by Rani. We are going to do Rani's quick intro and then dive right in. Put your questions in the Q&A and we will, take them certainly at the end and possibly throughout if we get an eye on something interesting. So Rani, can you do your intro, please?
Sure, and hopefully you can hear me as well.
Yes.
Good. That's an achievement already. So I'm actually in Tel Aviv. So it's 8 p.m. here. We were joking that this is wine, but it's not. It's Coke. And
Rani, you don't have to confess everything.
I know. Root beers. I've been with Aqua pretty much since the beginning, so about 7 years. And we, to those of you who don't know us, we specialize in cloud native security. Before Aqua, I was 25 years in enterprise software, so I'm old.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah.
We'll take that as part of your intro. Cool. Well, Rani, do you want to start slides? Yes, here we are at a fireside. If only we were really at one, that would be a lot of fun. So why don't you talk a little bit more about why Aqua exists, what problems you're setting out to solve, and also how you came on board and why you care about this stuff.
Sure. So, when we started, this is back in 2015, cloud was already happening, obviously. It's been around. But a lot of it was lift and shift. And the whole cloud native movement just started. And people didn't even call it that, but basically containers, a bit of serverless. And what we realized at that stage is that the use of these technologies, the fact that people are using those technologies is just an outcome of other things that have happened at the same time. DevOps in general, and the use of CI/CD, microservices architectures, and of course,
I'm going to make you define all your terms. CI/CD?
Oh, sure. Continuous integration, continuous deployment or delivery, depending on whose definition you believe. But it's basically that concept that as you write software, it's continuously integrated rather than having a kind of a waterfall approach where you compile everything in the end into one big monolith. And what this does, it allows you to update your applications bit by bit rather than in large chunky releases. And also, if you're based on a microservices architecture, meaning that you're breaking up your application into smaller pieces that communicate with each other, then you're also more resilient because then you can update these pieces separately and basically have a very continuous uptime for your application. In the cloud, of course, it scales infinitely pretty much.
Yeah.
So
I want to just interject here because I think it's helpful to define terms. So like when we talk about DevSecOps or whatever, any of the terms that kind of approximate that, I think that is what we're really referring to. And that is kind of inherently cloudy at its base, right? Because the idea that, you know, you move from 6 or 9 or 18-month delivery timelines to these short agile sprints. And if you believe Conway's law, which of course is not actually a law, but kind of a theorem, the idea that like the ways you will organize your employees also, and in this case, developers and security teams, will reflect the products that you're building. So the idea of Conway's law is that like your organization reflects what it outputs. And I think it has really changed the nature of software delivery. And of course, when we talk about delivery, the reason we're talking about software layers is because if you're in the cloud, we, the cloud provider, are doing the hardware layers for you, right? We're doing the concrete floors up through layer 4, the hypervisor. So I think there's something like basic and invisible in a lot of ways about how we are even using these terms and define, like the starting point at which we're defining here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think people, well, especially DevSecOps, I guess it itself is a very loaded term. You know, you can't just buy DevSecOps, right? It's not a
no,
product,
not
right?
even on Amazon. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Wait, so I mean, why don't we dig into that? Why can't you buy DevSecOps?
Right. So, you know, as I was saying, I think, you know, all these trends came together and they're actually, you can see that they come from different areas, right? So there are organizational trends and process trends. And then there are architectural trends and then, you know, software stack, you know, or whatever technology components changes. And all of these came together to create this new way of developing and running application. And this impacted, or we realized that it's going to impact security in a big way because it's now a lot faster. There are a lot more moving parts. It's more dynamic when it runs, you know, goes up and down, scales up and down. It's orchestrated as opposed to managed, you know, manually. There's no permanence of network address, you know, like an IP address. All of those things, on the one hand, made the old security approaches obsolete or ineffective. But on the other hand, and that's the good news, enables us to create something that ultimately would be a lot more secure because we are embedded much, much more deeply into the fabric of how an application is created and run. And we can peer much, much deeper into it, not treat it like a black box or something that you bolt on security as an afterthought to. And so I think that really is the essence. When I think of DevSecOps, I'm thinking of that integration of security into that fabric. And how you do it, there are many ways.
And when you say peer, you mean in the literal sense, not in the networking sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a you know, term of art as well as a straight English term. So tell me a little more about where, oh, look at our little graphic here. Tell me a little more about why Aqua felt like there was a problem to be solved here, and where you kind of fit into the solutioning. Like, why should we care? What is the problem to be solved? What's the job to be done in Clay Christensen's terms? He's a Harvard Business School, or was a Harvard Business School professor who, he's pretty interesting, actually. If folks haven't read, he has a number of books, The Innovator's Dilemma, The Innovators, whatever. And he started looking at like Dell chips back in the 90s. And he was really kind of a technologist at heart, but he also was looking at like, what are people like using this for, instead of what can it do? Or, and so he framed it as jobs to be done, which I find useful as a conceptual kind of framework. But anyway, yes, tell me what the job to be done was. That
well, I think, the job to be done is, first of all, to be able to understand where the risks are and where you can insert control points that will allow you to identify malicious or suspicious activity and then stop it. And with the loss of the traditional perimeter on the one hand, and then the loss
perimeter
of
is dead, long live the perimeter. Okay.
Yeah, the traditional and on the other hand, the inability to control, for example, things like configuration, right? I mean, we used to have servers that would have names and would sit somewhere in a server room. They even had like a permanent physical location, right? And not just an IP address. And they would always run the same application. Let's say, I don't know, SharePoint. And you knew that server runs SharePoint for the past 3 years. And maybe over Christmas or New Year's, they would upgrade and patch it. And that was it. And with cloud native applications, that doesn't exist. You can't control configuration. And you have all this new code flowing in all the time. And with new code come new vulnerabilities and new dependencies and new configuration issues. And then you have infrastructure as code. So things move a lot faster than security teams can keep up with them. There are many more developers. If you want to take a macro approach to this, there are many more developers in the world writing code than there are security professionals able to understand and secure that code. And so
maybe, although, I mean, I think we should be increasingly pairing devs and security engineers, or hiring devs to be security engineers.
Ergo DevSecOps, right? And so,
exactly.
Right. So we can look at this as a problem, or we can look at it as a path to the solution. And we understood very early on that this notion of full life cycle security, of understanding, looking at security as something that starts in development as early as possible, and not just something that happens once you deploy the application, that has to happen if we want to improve things. And for that to happen, you have to, I wouldn't say turn developers into security professionals, because that's not their job, but basically co-opt them or involve them by embedding as much as you can automation of security within their existing processes and systems and ways of work.
Yeah, I want to pull on that. So what do you think is the relationship between DevSecOps and automation? I mean, like how do we think of, because these are terms that get bandied about, but I actually think they're extremely woven, but we don't often define what it means to understand in practice how these play out.
I don't think you can do DevSecOps effectively at any kind of significant scale without a significant amount of automation. And by automation, I mean things that happen without being triggered by a human. And the reason is that DevOps practices or DevOps methods.
Well, and by triggered by a human, you mean manually triggered by a human.
Manually, yeah, by every.
Automations are always
obviously they're put in there by a human at some point, but once, right. And then they just happen. So DevOps, the DevOps process itself has a lot of automation, and there's DevOps people like to automate everything. Nobody wants to sit there, with their finger on a button waiting to deploy. deployment should happen based on criteria and all sorts of triggers that happen. Nobody wants to scale out when they see that their website is crashing. They want this to happen automatically, right? So
yeah,
security has to track that. Yeah.
So let's dig into some of those more operationally, because I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, but you're kind of like skating on the surface of some very real world scenarios. When you talk about risk, for example, like the idea that your availability is down. Well, how would we mitigate that? By auto scaling, by, like, can you talk about some of the situations in which this comes into play?
Sure. So, let's start with managing vulnerabilities, which is a huge topic in its own right. The market is very clearly is moving away from this notion of we can't have vulnerabilities or we can't have severe vulnerabilities in our runtime environment, for example, to a notion that says I need to manage risk optimally to reduce the impact those vulnerabilities can have on my environment. And why is that? First of all, because the number of vulnerabilities is just growing, especially in open source. The more widely used something is, the more known vulnerabilities there are, right? I mean, this is something that people need to understand.
There's such a
vulnerabilities are not a bad. When something has a lot of vulnerabilities, it means that a lot of people were looking into it and discovered vulnerabilities.
There's such a textured relationship between open source and security, and I'm serious. Like, it is not a negative one; it is a textured one.
Yes.
Yeah. Go on.
And so if let's say that, I don't know, let's say that I'm an online retail company, and I now, I'm running without any kind of severe vulnerabilities, but now there's a severe vulnerability that was just discovered, and quickly examining my environment,
like hypothetically in Java, just hypothetically.
Yeah, with a number attached, and it's just before Christmas, height of shopping season, and I discovered that my online retail applications, my website, web, mobile app, etc., they're affected by this vulnerability, meaning they're now vulnerable. What do I do? Do I shut them down? No, of course not. So there are several things I can do. I can mitigate, so I can basically have the security team put controls in place that will detect or prevent exploit of that vulnerability. I can try and remediate, meaning I can, for example, roll back versions to versions that didn't have that, if it's possible, or update to a newer version that, preferably that doesn't have that vulnerability. Not always possible either, right? So there is a variety of things, but the first thing I need to understand is, am I impacted? And how am I impacted? Is this really in my production environment? Or maybe it's in some, back-end application running somewhere where no one can get to it, or no one can get to it easily. And so these things matter, right? And this is an extreme example, but on an ongoing basis, take any large enterprise environment, there are going to be thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities in the code that they're using. But if you narrow it down to exploitable vulnerabilities that are actually in running applications, vulnerabilities that maybe are remotely exploitable, vulnerabilities have very large impact, and you put all of that into a blender and come out with a risk score for that vulnerability that actually reflects the context of that environment, then you get a much better outcome, because you're not dealing with a long list of vulnerabilities that you're not going to fix anyway, or the wrong list in terms of priorities, where you're maybe only looking at absolute score or severity of the vulnerability, which may not be relevant to your environment specifically. So that's one example,
right?
Where
and of course, the scores are in some sense, a general calculation. The CVE database was created with room for 9,999 because we thought that was like a reasonable number at the time. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, there have been also ways in which we're building, on this. Well, I think I coined this term, but on the thought skeletons of other people. We're building on top of the code that others have already embedded into the ways that we're operating. And there's something kind of like beautiful and dangerous about that, and kind of human. One of the things that I find compelling about the conversation around DevSecOps, obviously we care a lot because, and this is sort of like the undercurrent that we haven't said out loud, because innovation runs on it, right? Like we get better results, we get better innovation, we get better responses to current security issues because we can be more tactical and more agile. Agile with a lowercase a, not agile like just the software methodology. But there is this good that we're chasing, which is actually the innovative side. That security is not only done to lock things down; it's done to keep things moving.
Yes,
and do it in a responsible way, right? And I think there is some element of this that requires us to then reevaluate who and what we're hiring for. And I think you hinted at this. You want to talk about that a little bit more, and about your kind of philosophy of hiring at Aqua, and how you think DevSecOps plays into sort of like workforce dynamics changing.
Yeah, I'll just touch on one point that relates to the previous topic, which is the right or wrong ways of doing DevSecOps. So one clearly wrong way of doing DevSecOps is using absolute gates, where I say, if this happens, I'm not going to let this deploy in production. Because then, first of all, you're just going to antagonize developers. You're going to stifle innovation. You're going to possibly create some false positives, which nobody likes. And a much better approach is what we call guardrails. That basically, it's a demarcation of the right thing to do, but it doesn't stop you from drawing outside the lines occasionally. And you need to use the hammer only when you really, really have to, when it's like super severe, in terms of risk. So guardrails, as an example, we talked about automation. You can insert all sorts of security testing into your build process, as automated steps. And then they output the result to the developer in the IDE or in the CI/CD IDEs, the co-development environment for the developer, and then they see it there and they can decide whether it's something that they need to do something about right now or not. And later on, you can deal with that if they keep doing it. You can deal with that on a continuous basis, but not at that very moment. And that's the other part.
Yeah.
So you asked about hiring.
You also mentioned infrastructure as code, and this will play into your lead into the hiring here too. But I think if we're going to think about guardrails, a lot of this should be like minimizing snowflakes, creating templatization and vending accounts, vending environments, having things ready to go. So whether you're using CloudFormation or Terraform, being able to refine your permissioning that's embedded there. Again, the perimeter is dead, long live the perimeter, right? Like these will have the concepts that were traditional perimeters played out in both fine-grained and traditional ways, right? And I think there's something helpful about folks understanding or like getting to a comfort level with the idea of these notional logical perimeters coupled with the fine-grained permissioning that operates the way that we would expect a traditional perimeter to. But anyway, move into hiring, because I think folks who want to do infrastructure as code and then security as code are the same folks who want to automate away their problems, right? Yep. We like to joke that we hire lazy security engineers, people who want to never solve the same problem twice, Yep. So tell me a little more, because I think it's actually really, at least in my view, although we still see a fairly, homogenous representation in terms of the folks who are in the security world, I think this is a call to action. Like, I really think that we should be seeing creative, architectural, folks who are not just babysitting this device over here and whether it's plugged in, but folks who are thinking in terms of like truly human terms, like things that require creativity and automation and innovation
and maybe kind of better human or emotional intelligence.
Exactly. Yeah,
EQ.
The stuff that life is made of, we want to use that here. You know what I mean? Like,
yes, because software is made of code, but people write code.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Exactly.
that's where that stands. And DevSecOps to me, we said earlier that DevSecOps is not an off-the-shelf product, but DevSecOps to me is a continuous process of improvement. Like, you're never done with DevSecOps if you're doing it right.
Yeah.
If you're not doing it right, you think you're done. But if you're doing it right, you're never done. And
but you get better.
Of course, you get better, and you find ways of measuring yourself and improving on those KPIs and metrics. And any kind of incident that happens in production is a failure, right? If you're able to stop things before they happen in production, that's a win.
Certainly in production, yeah. But I also think that feedback loops and how we get better over time, you know what I mean? Reducing and to our point about workforce, I think there are elements of the things that burn people out are manual tasks. They don't want to be doing stuff that computers can do. And we aren't even that good at it. You know what I mean? Like, we're imprecise. We are like imperfect, and computers can run exactly the equations that you program them with, for better or worse, right? We got to know how to refine that human decision making to minimize that gray area. But I think this is what truly will enable the security folks to not feel like they are doing jobs that are better served by robots.
One of the best measurements I found, or proxies I found, to kind of taking the pulse of an industry, and I haven't done this with DevSecOps recently, but it's an interesting exercise to do, is to go on LinkedIn and see how many jobs are listed that have a term in them. We did that in the early days. We did that with Docker to validate whether this is a growing market. And the job descriptions with Docker went like this in 2015, 16.
Interesting.
And I'm pretty sure that if you did that research now with DevSecOps, you'd find maybe not huge numbers, but you'll see growth, right? And the same with like infrastructure as code or Terraform or CloudFormation, any of those keywords that signify a technology or an approach, you can see how they're taking off in the job market. And that's a great indicator. I think overall, the kind today to be a successful, to be a good developer today, I think you need to know a lot more, have a broader understanding of what you're doing and the impact of what you're doing, not just within the little code snippet that you're writing right now, but understanding how this will play out in a production environment. And I think that's one of the, DevOps does that, right? It kind of shortens the loop between developing and running an application. And the same with DevSecOps. It shortens the loop, or closes the loop very early between fail and fix, or vulnerability and remediation, or any of those pairs of things that need to happen in order to improve.
I love it. And I guess we have kind of hinted at it, but let's be explicit that we are hoping that more folks get into security and into DevOps, that folks from all different backgrounds, whether you were an architect or an artist or a first grade teacher, there is room in this industry for you. And in fact, we do better when there are more folks in the room who have encountered different problems, spoken different languages, understood things, contextually. There is so much need right now for folks who approach problems in a creative way. And I think the time is ripe. So anyway, I just wanted to say the water is warm. Rani, I've been like a very not fireside chatter because I've just been sharing with you, but I'm going to turn over the notional mic to you for maybe 20 minutes or 15, and then we'll take some questions for sure. Folks who are listening, please feel free to put more questions in the Q&A. We are open to them and like, we're a resource, so just free. Use it,
so,
right?
Yeah. So I guess what I want to know, and I'm sure the people on the call want to know, is, you work for AWS, obviously, the largest public cloud provider. What do you see as AWS's role in security, in terms of enabling your users?
Yeah, it's interesting because I sit in AWS security and I work on, improving the security of our own shop, of course. And so that gives me the empathy as a shop that runs on AWS to talk to a lot of customers about how they approach it. And then, of course, to help refine our products so that they get delivered in a way that's consistent with security best practices. And those areas speak to each other because, as I mentioned, there's a lot of empathy that's required in terms of understanding like how this is hard. And as you mentioned, a process, right? You're never like done, but you get better over time, hopefully. I think in terms of the mechanisms that we've seen work for DevSecOps, there are two main ones that I think we have, and I should say, like, Amazon is a big believer in mechanisms. So like good intentions are not enough. It's got to be somehow embedded in the operational cadence of how you do it. And there are two things that I think matter a lot in terms of how we approach DevSecOps, SecDev, whatever. I will just call it DevOps because that's kind of how we do it, is to bring the security within those boundaries. And one is that in our security shop, everything is a trouble ticket, but increasingly they get auto acknowledged and remediated by robots. So we try to build like these layers of sand of automations on top of each other so that whether you're requesting, for example, an exception to employee guardrailing, or whether you have an issue that is, a perceived phishing scam, is it or isn't it, like to the extent that we can know and then write away, WRIT away, the codification to be able to acknowledge and or fix it and or acknowledge when it's fixed. Those are really helpful toolings. And it's also the kind of thing that saves folks from like the mindless horribleness of manual security jobs that I think was the thing that we as a security community never wanted to be spending our energy, our human lives on. The other mechanism that we have that I think is useful to highlight is security guardians or champions, we call them, that are embedded in service teams. So every AWS product has ownership over the security of their product or their service. But AWS security kind of like has umbrella arms around some of how they operate. And one of the things that we notice is if they have a security engineer embedded, and by the way, it doesn't need to be a person who's spent 30 years being a security engineer. It can be someone who we just say, please wear this hat. Usually they are raising a hand because they're interested. They then streamlined our AppSec reviews. So like efficiently that we realized we should just do this across, like this should be a function that we, inculcate. And so there have been ways that we try to outreach to customers with the ways to do this operationally. I think ultimately, as you know, customers have to build their own security practices and figure out how they're going to sort of organizationally grow up from some sense of it, like to be able to move from those long, fairly static development cycles to the really agile ones. And it's kind of draining because you're constantly getting feedback on what's working and what's not. And it's exhausting. Like, it requires a lot of work, but I also think that it works better, gives more dividends, and allows us to innovate at such a higher pace. And it's such an old trope, the idea that like security is a cost center. I just fundamentally don't believe that. I think it's just an enabler, hopefully, but certainly it's a part of doing business. I don't know who doesn't get, like, there is no way to do business. By business, I mean any version of getting stuff done.
I would argue that not having security is a huge cost center.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the mindset that it is like a cost center is, I think, old fashioned and incorrect.
Yeah. And so, they brought up a slide about the shared responsibility model. I mean, how do you balance? That's the word I was looking for. How do you balance giving Amazon users as much freedom as possible in terms of creating what it is they need to create, but also not letting them make huge security mistakes?
It's actually a really critical question. Again, like, these foundational things are where it all, I think the heartbeat is here, right? And there are two ways that I think are useful to think of this. One is how we as an AWS shop think about the security guardrails we put around our own employees, and how we allow for really permissive environments, but also we do a lot of logging and thresholding. And like, every employee has had their manager paged at 4 a.m. because they didn't respond to something. But that in itself is sort of a symptom, or sometimes sounds negative, an indicator of the kind of culture of believing that security is worth answering the phone for. And I think that's important as an enterprise. When folks ask me, like, how do we breed a culture of security? It's like, you breed it by doing it, like, start making sure your executives know that they're going to have to prioritize this. So I guess layer one is like the empathy I have with other security shops around how to do the kinds of guardrailing that are important, while also giving enough permissioning that folks can run and build and innovate. But the other side is the kind of traditional definition of shared responsibility model, where we're talking about the role that cloud plays, right? And I've kind of alluded to this with the layers of the stack, and I'm talking about the OSI stack here, where we're talking about, the concrete floors, guards and gates, HVAC, up through traditionally layer 4, the hypervisor. Although, of course, if you go into managed services, you're going to get higher into those layers of the stack, where, I mean, the whole definition of cloud is that we manage that security for you. Like, the best patching is the patching you don't have to do. At the same time, we're not going to just like hand you a Barbie dream house that's already built. I mean, like, this cup is a zero trust cup. Nothing comes in or out. It's not connected to the internet. It also doesn't do anything. Like, it doesn't matter. We've got to have the room for innovators to build and grow. And, one of the things that Eric Brandwein always loves to point out is that we feel validated sometimes, or I guess we feel grateful sometimes when we see customers build something we never anticipated using tools that we developed, using services and features. And we just didn't think that folks would use it in this way for this purpose. Right. So this kind of like freedom that they obviously have, because they're doing stuff we don't even know or don't anticipate, don't calculate for. And that's just because we want to build sort of an open world. The whole notion of cloud is that, sure, we don't like lock it down for you. You don't want that. You want to build. You want to be free. You want to customize. You want to act in accordance with your business needs. And I'm defining business broadly here as, public sector as well, where a bottom line may be a policy goal, right? Where you want to reach constituents, or you want to achieve policy outcomes. But there are ways that we are thinking about how we can enable folks to just like have the open world conceptual frameworks with all the tooling that saves them time from a build perspective and with the security that's baked into that. So things like our Nitro ecosystem, which is, our hardware that underpins all of EC2, and of course, like Lambda and things that are built on top of EC2. So these are, and that includes things like config rules and Event Bridge and all the things that invoke Lambdas. When we talk about automations on AWS anyway, these are Lambdas under the hood, which are these small serverless compute functions. These are, managed by, and like the hardware that we invested in developing. By the way, this came out of Annapurna Labs, which is an Israeli acquisition. You remember this?
Yep.
But anyway, we built it to have no human access. We built it to have bare metal like performance. There are things that are security inheritances that are also just embedded in the stuff that we build.
Yeah, I think Lambda is actually a great example, right? Lambda basically does away with a whole host of security risks just by virtue of being of running as a function on completely abstracted infrastructure.
Exactly.
So things like escalation to the host or network traversal become a lot more difficult. Well, impossible to more difficult for an attacker to do. Plus the short run times. All of those things make it's a lot more secure by design, right? I mean, there are some security risks with. I mean, you can do stupid things with Lambda too, but you have to try harder.
There are configuration best practices that we want to help folks ensure that they do, right?
Yeah.
And there will always be folks who use traditional EC2
if you put your keys somewhere where they're not secure, or if you're opening resources to the function.
But even if you're using traditional EC2, you do have responsibility for patching, and you need to know that. And so the shared responsibility model is really important, just so that folks have more awareness of what falls on their side. My personal shorthand is, if you can toggle it, you own it. But there's a lot that's happening under the hood that we are doing sort of as security inheritances. Meanwhile, we're deeply invested in trying to get our customers to do the secure thing, and frankly, to make the secure thing to do the easy thing to do for both our employees and our customers. And that's hard, as you know.
Ooh. Okay, one of my favorite topics. So, what do you see as kind of emerging threats to cloud users in the security space?
So we have a company policy against FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So I'm definitely not going to get up here and just be like, let's worry about this thing and, Chicken Little, the sky is falling. I think my personal view is that you build your house right, and you don't have to chase down every current, wolf who's trying to blow little pigs' houses down. But using another fairy tale illusion here. But that being said, I think we're going to continue to see, improvements / investment on, as we alluded to, open source, and the ways that there will always be a next open source security issue. And that's just because of the nature of how software got developed over time by humans, as we mentioned, who are imperfect, and also who often build in something, like even Log4j, right? That was a feature, not a bug in theory. It just turned out that there were ways that folks could exploit it. And so I think we'll continue to see work around that. There was a Python one the year before Log4j, and folks didn't actually even notice it that much because folks just kind of rose up and patched for it. But anyway, I think we'll continue to see work there. I think we will continue to see opportunistic actors like ransomware groups, folks taking advantage of proxies and botnets and other things where as I have joked, but not really before, like, you don't even have to be that good because it's all for hire. And it's frustrating because these are solvable. These are not 0 days. You know what I mean? Like, for the most part, these are things we know about that can be solved. So doing your basic hygiene and your patching and your credential management, making sure that you're using all the kinds of tooling that exists today, it's really important, and also helps you just kind of build that house right. I think there will always be interesting questions on the landscape, ML security and how we understand what goes into our models and then are able to recognize if someone's trying to augment it. Those kinds of questions I see coming down the pike. But I think that there will always, the thing about security is that, like, there are, I think, two broad categories. One is sort of degradation and stuff that just stops working for, time and other reasons. And then there are sort of motivated attacker reasons. And those both range in terms of sophistication, or I should say severity. But I think, putting some thought into your posture, your industry, whether you are, someone who folks are motivated to go after, whether you are someone who has legacy technology that's vulnerable because you haven't updated it, the longer it takes you to patch, the more danger you are when you patch, right? Of downtime. Like, there's stuff that is knowable here. And so trying to figure out how to get there. And I guess I would just say, start somewhere. It may feel like your work is never done. That's probably true. Start somewhere, right? Do the stuff that is the most critical and that demands the budget the most. Turn on guard duty. I mean, guard duty does not pay me, but I am just telling you, like, I think, one of the no-brainers is turn on guard duty.
Yeah, I think, again, there's a lot of the automation that's now in place through insecurity tools, doesn't matter which ones, virtually any security tool, is there to basically, ensure that you're aware of what's going on and are able to fix it in a timely fashion. So it's, a lot of it is not, like you said, a lot of it is like basic hygiene. It's not rocket science, right? Understanding when your, configuration of a service drifted, or when, you have an exposed secret in your application layer in the Lambda function, for example, or things like that. These are things that are utterly preventable. But if you weren't able to prevent them, you at least want to know when they happen.
Exactly. And they still take work, right? Like, so.
And again, it's the people. People are work, right? So if you want
to take action on stuff, it's going to require some kind of affirmative decision. And I think that's exactly right. Like, these are, for the most part, things that are in your wheelhouse today, but some of it takes prioritization, investment, action, because there will always be competing business goods. But I think, part of this is also the decision that you're going to invest in the version of security approaches that is cloudy, because the things you're describing are also things that are like, visibility on logging and monitoring, or, configuration posture and stuff, like config rules. Like, what a luxury that you get to just see and then auto remediate if you want, back to with known rule sets if you want that, whatever. Like, there's such a sweetness there that used to be a lot more manual and a lot less knowable, but only if you kind of like move over to this other side where you believe it, where
before the internet, there were no network attacks. So
there you go. And you know what I mean? Like least privileged, for example,
the good old days. Yeah.
It might have felt very manual before to just, and like convenient to just give everyone in your company, a physical perimeter. So like when you're in the office, everything goes, right? Well, we know that doesn't work anymore for a number of reasons. And also it means that we're going to have to think about it differently, implement it differently, prune and refine our policies differently and reason about them. And we can do that in a variety of ways, including access analyzer or, inspector or other things. So I guess my point is, with great power comes great responsibility, right? Like we have more tools and we also need to accommodate and adjust our ways of thinking about security so that we take advantage of those.
All right. Shall we open the floor to questions?
Let's do it.
Yeah.
All righty. So our first question reads, what is the relationship between risk and security, and how do you measure, determine, and communicate improvement?
Ooh.
Ronnie, why don't you take this one or to start?
That's a big one. Right. So I think, I think security is viewed more operationally, as in the number one job of the security team is that you don't get breached, right? And everybody keeps their jobs and the business is not hurt. Risk is a much more kind of fickle notion, much more multidimensional. Basically, you want to look at, what are the odds of something bad happening, and if it happens, how may it impact your business negatively? And I think in today's world, where we are being attacked all the time, right? It's just a fact of life. It's not like you're not gonna put up a server that's open to the internet anywhere. It doesn't matter if it's on a public cloud or not. And not see it attacked within a very short.
I remember a Wired article that tracked, I think it was Wired, that tracked an IoT, like a toaster, and they thought it would be like a day or two. It was 15 seconds before it was part of it.
Wow, that's fast. I can do from our own research. If you're looking at like Kubernetes nodes or Docker instances, instances that run Docker, we see targeted attacks on those within about 30 to 40 minutes max.
Those are targeted too, right?
Targeted,
They're not roundups.
Yeah. Not just pings, but targeted attacks at those. So again, I think, and that's where managing risks comes in, because you have to assume you're under attack. You have to assume that attackers have penetrated you in some way, shape, or form, and then you have to basically manage that risk. So focus on the important things, make it harder for the attackers to make any significant damage, and be able to respond quickly, right? And identify and respond quickly if something really bad happens. So you're on this constant. It's like having a nasty neighbor that's like making noise and bad smells and whatnot. And it's a fact of life, unless you move. It's a fact of life, and you want to draw a certain line, right? You don't want that neighbor barging into your apartment, right? So this is something that you have to manage. And I think today, increasingly, security operations are risk based or risk driven. So decisions to make optimal security decisions, you have to understand the risk.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I also would say, I think you're right. And you gave me the idea that basically when you talk about risk, it's often in a business sense. So you're talking to the board or to folks who may not actually care about like what your time to patch looks like. I mean, they do, but they don't. They want you to translate it into observable business outcomes. And so I think that when we talk about security as part of risk, and of course, security is not the only risk either. Like there is reputational risk with founders going out being weird or, like whatever, natural disasters happening or regime changes or things that like are in other buckets here. But I think when we think about security's relationship to risk, I think it's actually a helpful lever on which we want to couch our relevance, because I have always believed that like there is I've already referred to the fact that I don't think that security is a cost center. I actually think it is part of what you're delivering, right? And that is not just to say like avoiding a breach, although that would be nice. But in the same sentence, Rani said, like, you're going to get hit, right? So I think that there is actually this sense in which what you're delivering to your end consumer, whoever that is, if you're a government, it's a citizen. If you're a business, it's who has chosen to do business with you. But like they care about the ways that you are delivering your service to them, and security is part of that package. I think folks are also increasingly demanding better security standards and better observability and transparency into those standards. And I think that, there is no folks who think that by not moving to cloud, or that by not disclosing security, or that by like that they can stay still, do nothing, and avoid this conversation are missing the point. Like you will already have paid a price by staying where you are. And like, is it the one that you actually feel comfortable with would be like that, and have accepted would be a question I have for folks.
A lot of the famous breaches in the last few years were in old legacy applications or operating systems. They were not in the newest, cloud-based stuff.
Yeah, I think that, what's the cost of staying still would be a question that I would ask my enterprise if I was working there.
Mm-hmm.
So our next question reads, how do you maintain a consistent feedback loop across the software lifecycle and support shared context for collaboration?
Yeah. So I think that there are a few kind of prerequisites here. One is everyone has to work off the same playbook and the same data set. You can't have, one set of, let's say, vulnerability scoring and reporting for developers and another one for SecOps. And I think so I think that cross visibility is super important. And then, of course, speaking of automation, you want to be able to get things to the right person who's able to fix them with the right information and the right priority. So, and again, this is where DevSecOps really comes into play, because if you're doing it right, like in the old days, let's say, an application was developed, it was compiled, it was released, it was put on some server somewhere. And then after it's running for a few months, we discover there's an issue, and it takes us a long time to find out what the issue is, and then who to send it back to get fixed, or maybe we just patch it on the server if we can. Now, if you do it very quickly, if you have those guardrails in place, you can immediately provide the feedback loop to the developer. So you're shortening that time span significantly, and you're also shortening the not just the time to kind of provide that information, etc., but you're also doing away with all that unnecessary search of who did it, where do I find this person? Is he still with the company? And so forth. So it's just a much more efficient way of doing it. And you can use whatever tools you're used to, whether it's like opening tickets, like like was mentioned before, or you have some Slack channel, or maybe you have ServiceNow, or any of those solutions that allow you to track ticketing or collaboration information. But ultimately, the trigger for that action has to be agreed upon and prioritized in a way that would make it effective. You can't just send 1,000 remediation requests to a team of developers and expect them to sort out themselves the priorities and what they'll do first and what they won't do at all, and so forth.
I know we're almost at time. I won't weigh in much, but I think, so this is where I think there's two dimensions in which the old model is shifting. And that's, I guess, the underlying byline of this talk, is that the old world has shifted and we are moving into new interactions. And that takes place both at a code level and at a human level. And so when we talk about, these kinds of interactions between whatever dev teams, in our case, those are service teams that are developing the technologies that folks are consuming, and then the security shop, that those are increasingly a handshake over the fence. Meanwhile, that security is built in under the hood in a lot of ways and guardrailed. And that also, as we think about software development, that like things are not thrown over the fence, right? That things take a different, that consumption of products, whether it's AWS or Aqua, like that these are not just like thrown over the fence and said, good luck, right? That they are managed in a sense that is more hands-on, more full service than they used to be in a manual world where you paid for what you got and you got what you paid for. Anyway, Cody, I'm going to let you close us out. Rani, it has been a pleasure. I'm going to post my Twitter handle here. Folks are welcome to reach out. And thank you so much, Rani. Feel free to take 30 seconds and do your last words. Not that you're dying. It was not intended to be a last word. I don't know. Your closing statement.
Closing statement. Wow. Make security part of your journey.
Security is already part of your journey, whether you realize it or not.
Don't wait for the end.
Let's do it. Let's do it intentionally and with consciousness.
Awesome. Well, Merritt and Rani, thank you both for coming on and hanging out with me for a full hour today. I really appreciate the depth and really the level of conversation that you two took our topics today. It's a great format, and I really appreciate really just how in depth you two went. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you later, folks. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye, everyone.
Just a reminder to our audience today that this session was recorded, so you should receive an email with a link to access that recording on demand. But if you just can't wait, it will be living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and be sure to look in the on-demand section. So we did mention that we'd be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So our 4 winners are Lev C, Satyashil R, Renee V, and Geetha P. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your email inbox to claim that gift card. But if you don't happen to see that email, just check your spam folder. So I'd like to thank AWS and Aqua Security for sponsoring today's program. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. We do ask for just one extra moment of your time to fill out a brief survey that will pop up on your screen as soon as we close out. But otherwise, we hope to see everyone at an upcoming Techstrong Learning program. Have a great rest of your day.